Hey everyone, I'm Nato King with more Folklore. This time we've only got one DLC quest to do, which is a timed battle arena. And after that, a whole lot of grinding for karmas. None of it's going to be very interesting to watch, which is why I've got a special guest here to tell us something about some of the real-world legends that inspired the game.
Hi, I'm Red Rover. You can call me Rover. Everyone calls me Rover, and I'm here to be the pseudo expert for the LP, and hopefully not too bad at it. So yeah. Quests today. So there should be a lot to talk about as regards the individual folks. But I thought we might start off with a bit about the village, if that's okay with you, Nato King.
Anything you want to talk about is fine with me.
Well, there is actually a real-life Doolin, an actual village by that name, in County Clare, which is quite famous for its traditional Irish music, and also for having a very large cave made of limestone, with rather enormous stalactites. It's in the Burren, which is this rather interesting geological location on the west of Ireland, which is basically formed from limestone erosion, and it's really quite famous for having some of the most unique geological and environmental features in most of Western Europe. So, all in all, Doolin, although rather small and insignificant in terms of the games world, is actually quite important in terms of the real Doolin. So, quite an unusual contrast there.
But I would take it they don't actually have a tradition of saying they can talk to the dead.
Not that I'm aware of, though you never know. It could be all very hush-hush. But that's really where the similarities end. There isn't any large stone formations, and as you say, certainly no means to travel to any netherworlds, or at least none that they've let on anyway. So. But I see you're swapping around the folks there, which actually is probably a good little segue. As someone pointed out in the thread, you had been mispronouncing the poor Puka there. I'm sure it was very disappointed with you. But
yeah, I've studied Japanese, so I tend to pronounce everything as if it's Japanese, particularly in Japanese games.
But anyway, to be fair to you though, it's not really a standard spelling. In fact, I've never seen it spelled that way ever. It's not one that I'm familiar with, but it should obviously be the Puka, as was pointed out. But it's also not really anything resembling a Puka, at least by standard fare. In County Down, which is up the north in Ireland, it is usually a goblin-ish looking thing, and in actually, I should say that it is a sort of shapeshifter, so by all rights, you could say that it could look like this if it felt so inclined, but it's not usually a tiny goblin. It's normally more of a horse-looking thing, or a goat, if you happen to live in Roscommon. But it's also a lot more dangerous and malevolent than the game seems to want you to think it is. Which I
don't know,
found
they all attack me.
Yes, but do they kill you?
Not most of the time. They're very easy to fight.
No. Well, the Pukas in Irish mythology, at least, they have equivalents. There is a Puka in Welsh mythology, which is reasonably similar, and they have equivalents in a lot of other European mythologies, but it's in its traditional form, it's almost exclusively Irish. It's rather infamous and is considered one of the more, as I say, malevolent, but certainly dangerous fairies, and one of the more feared. As I said, in County Down, it's generally considered to be a little goblin rather than the standard form. And up there, it is considered that if you don't leave a portion of your harvest behind for the Puka, there will be hell to pay. It's a rather demanding fairy. In fact, quite infamously, it's known to appear as a horse and force people to ride it, much like the Kelpie that you encounter in other mythologies. Except rather than drowning people, it throws you off and tries to break your spine, which is not very fun, all in all.
Yeah, that'll put a real nail in the coffin for all those people that are fond of horses.
Yep. It really does. It's not especially fun. In fact, there is a rather infamous story where a large black horse that could talk, no less, and lived in a cave somewhere in an unnamed part of the country, held an unfortunate village hostage for 3 generations, demanding various gifts and offerings for them on pain of death. So they're not a very nice creature at all, really. And also they're responsible for a rather pleasant little folk tale where one mustn't eat any overripe or otherwise unusual blackberries, such as like the kind that might be ripe before their time or anything like that, because they're considered to be the property of the puka, and if you eat them, it will kill you for eating its stuff. So yeah, not a fun thing, really, all in all.
So any connection between that and Nightshade, or?
Possibly. It's maybe more likely that something might cause blackberries to ripen ahead of time that would cause them to be toxic, or even be a connection to certain plants like lords and ladies, except that would be more similar to a raspberry than anything else, but still.
Alright, I was just thinking of the King's Quest VI, the Horse of Death stops to eat nightshade berries, and then that's when you catch it.
Well, you never know. As I should probably have prefaced, a lot of the myths, particularly when they cross bridges between, say, Ireland and Scotland, or Scotland and Wales, or anything like that, they tend to have a lot of weird and different variations. And even within Irish mythology itself, there's so many differences between the individual legends of each province that it's almost ridiculous. I mean, I'm talking from a very Leinster point of view, and so anyone in the thread from other parts can feel free to correct me or offer their more local versions of the various legends and myths.
Yeah, I figure it's always good to get more educational value, since I'm probably not providing a whole lot of entertainment.
Well, you say that, but there's no way we can't do both.
True. Well, anyway, to catch you up on the challenge here, now that it's almost over, this was a timed thing where if you capture a Kilmoulis id, that decreases your time significantly, which I'm about to do. That was stupid of me. The Pories increase your time, and Puka increase your time if you capture more than one at a time. I clearly didn't do enough of that.
Well, you know, you win some, you lose some. Speaking of the Kilmoulis, though, might as well segue into that. It's rather interesting. There's not that much to say about it, but I figure we might as well get it out of the way. It's a Scottish spirit, boggart-like, really more brownie-like than anything else, rather than boggart, but they share the similarity of occupying buildings, and specifically the Kilmoulis, which I assume is how it's pronounced. My Scots Gaelic isn't very good. But it occupies windmills and crushes flour, and that's pretty much all there is to it. It has hands, as you can see. But that's the story of the Kilmoulis. So, enjoy.
And we're gonna get to boggarts later in the game, of course.
Oh yes, that should be a fun story. Many fun tales to tell about boggarts, I assure you. But
and hopefully not too many crossovers with Harry Potter going on there.
Hopefully. I make no promises. But but while we're here on the screen, we also have Barguest, which was happening a lot in the previous video. The previous little video snippet challenge. And I have a few Barguest facts for you. On a general, like, sweeping statement case, the Barguest is not at all like it looks in the game, which is actually quickly becoming a running theme in the game. But but it does have an interesting history. It's basically a hellhound. It's got described as a big black dog with burning up red eyes, like all the fires of hell. It's chiefly English in nature, and often appears in woods at night or in crossroad intersections. It's very, very malevolent. It's usually a bringer of at least bad luck, but it's also occasionally very murderous, and lots of different locations, towns, villages like that all across England have all their own little variations on it with their own special names. But we'll get to all kinds of local stories about that in the future at some later date, so look forward to that.
Yeah, and I will believe that Barghest is murderous near the end of the video.
Ah, yes, that should be...
I mean, Puka tried to kill me and failed. Barghest very nearly succeeds.
They tend to do that. They're not very pleasant dogs. Or beast things, as the case is here. Speaking of beast things, and folks in general, Andrast, I see, is getting some use at last.
Pretty much the most annoying one I have to build up. I gotta kill 10 folks, and they're not very convenient.
Well, what are you gonna do? On the topic of Andrast, though, she does have a history. She is the goddess of war for the Iceni. The Iceni, if you don't know them, were a rather famous tribe. They were Pictish, Celtic, and they were ruled by the rather... well, they came to be ruled by the rather famous warrior queen Boudica, which some of our viewers may be familiar with. Lovely woman. Lots of misfortune to her and her daughters, unfortunately, but she came out on top in the end, at least for a certain value of on top. Pyrrhic victories, I guess. But basically Andrast is only really known to us because she is recorded as being invoked against the Romans by Boudica during her various exploits. We don't really know much about her other than that she's a goddess of war, more specifically thought to be equivalent to a goddess of victory, like the Greek Nike. She's otherwise pretty much a mystery. Maybe she actually does look like a giant bug. It's a mystery.
Well, she certainly rolls over her enemies.
Haha. Yes.
And right on past, not finishing them off at all most of the time.
Well, you know, everyone has their off days. Even goddesses of war. Bug goddesses of war. Whatever. Also, Triant's happening, I see. Or Trent, depending. I'm not sure there is a proper pronunciation. Speaking of, you might be interested to know that there is no such thing as a Triant. Which is to say, there are a lot of things like Triants. There are Dryads and Hamadryads from Greek mythology, and all of their ilk. Very common sort of thing, living trees. It's a common thing across most mythologies, but there's nothing specifically called a Triant. They're actually based on Tolkien's Ents, specifically, and they're a purely fictional creation, as far as I know. Anyway, anyone can feel free to correct me, but as far as I know, and as far as I can find, they're purely fictional. So,
yeah, see, I would have thought it was the other way around, and maybe Tolkien's are based on something.
It probably is. I mean, I doubt Tolkien just came up with the idea of a living tree out of the clear blue sky, although I may be giving him too little credit. But he's probably based on a dryad or any number of similar living tree equivalents, because it is a very common thing. Just nothing specifically called a treant or anything resembling, like, the name. So, if you think of it as a more generic term for a tree spirit, then yeah, it exists almost universally. So it's the opposite of what I just said.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised. I would have expected that one to have a more rich history than a lot of the other ones I've seen.
Well, sometimes these things surprise you. It's just the way with mythology. Speaking of...
speaking of surprises, look at what Andrast's next karma is.
Oh,
15 more folks! So I sped up the rest of this because I really, really don't think anyone wants to wait through that. Even with interesting information.
I think even I couldn't last that long. I'd have run out of facts. We'd all have to.
And then I accidentally back out of the room halfway through killing one.
Well, you know. But since we ran past that pori, I'll just dip into the complete lack of information I have on it. I don't know what a pori is. I don't know what it's meant to be. I have failed, I'm afraid, in that regard. It's just eluded me. So we'll have to rely on our pleasant folks at home to be our guide in that regard.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there's at least some folks in this game that are made up out of nowhere.
Well, Hammer Elephant is probably one of them then in that case. Or at least that's what
Yeah, the worst part of it is there's another one that looks almost identical in Chapter 3.
Ugh. And I'm sure that has equally little information. I'll just be dumbfounded again. Ugh. That's a lot of pukas.
Yep. Well, this is one of my favorite rooms to come to for any sort of grinding.
Just so many pukas to kill.
And this one at least works really well with Andrast.
Well, it is basically like bowling for pukas. You know.
Somebody needs to make a flash game of that or something.
10 puka bowling, just everywhere. It's gonna be a hit! Indie game sensation. 2013. But speaking of games, might be wise to discuss the world of the game of Folklore. Might be a worthy use of our time. It's a rather weird concept, all in all. This idea of a netherworld. It's alien to Irish mythology. In fact, probably one of the key reasons why, when Christianity came to Ireland, it was such a big hit, is because the idea of an afterlife in pre-Christian Ireland was not really a thing. It's one of the few mythologies that gave almost no focus to the idea of a world beyond. It wasn't that they had a concept of people just ceasing to exist. It was definitely a feeling that they remained, but not that they lived in some specific world beyond, or even that they remained in this world. It was just sort of a vague concept that there were people, you may or may not be able to communicate with them from beyond the grave if you had sufficient skills to do so, and whatever happened to them was a mystery. It's very strange, but they certainly had
so it seems kind of compatible with the way this game works then.
Yeah,
since they're going into these netherworld realms, that there are as many of them as there are stars in the sky, as we've been told.
Yeah,
we'll be seeing a lot of different ones and meeting different spirits of the dead in each one.
Yeah, it's all a mystery. But what is interesting is that, and is uncomfortably incompatible with the game, is that there is distinctly no connection between the dead and the fairies of Irish mythology, which I should finally point out are actually not called fairies in Irish mythology. The word fairy is obviously an English thing. It's as is the idea of fae or all that sort of stuff. In Ireland, and I'll get to other cultures possibly in a later video where I focus on them more thoroughly, but at least from in Ireland they are the Aoshi, which is which you might know. It's which translates to people, as in like a race or almost a nation, but not really, of the Barrows, which is where we get our tie-in to the dead, and that's about as far as it gets. If you think about pre-Christian Ireland, it spans an awfully long amount of time. The first settlers came to Ireland in about in the Mesolithic period, which is some 5,000–6,000 years, or with obviously more than that, but it's ages back. It's absolutely ridiculous. But we do have, why I say 5,000–6,000 years ago, is that we have structures from that time still around today, and to the people of shortly of say even 4,000 years ago, from today, these structures that were even older were something incredibly mysterious, something incredibly profound. I mean, if you look at Stonehenge in England, it's 5,000 years old, and it boggles the mind today. No one knows what it was for, or there are suspicions, but it's all, mysterious. But if you look to Ireland, we have Newgrange, which is even older than Stonehenge. It's 5,600 years old, and it's a passage tomb whose purpose, as far as we can determine, is entirely astronomical. On the winter solstice, at the same time every year, the sun reaches a certain point in the sky that it shines directly down the passage of this man-made hill and illuminates this little wall covered in carvings. And these sorts of structures, and even the dolmens where the ancient Irish would bury their dead, to the people even 4,000 years ago, this would have been fascinating and even terrifying. But it was really, to them, something so terrifying and otherworldly that it's not unusual that they should come up with this world of creatures that lived down in these barrows, in these dolmens, in these tombs beneath the ground, and were something so intrinsically linked to death but entirely separate from humanity, and that were entirely consumed with this sinister, malevolent aura. It's important to remember when you're talking about Irish mythology that the Irish, particularly before the advent of Christianity, were incredibly petrified of the inhabitants of the realm of the Barrows. It was really a very terrifying thing for them. And yeah,
I mean, if something is built, it's got to be built for someone. Right?
Yeah, exactly. To them, these tombs weren't tombs. I mean, the dead were buried in them. They were burnt and put under these upturned pots. So by the time their descendants came along and had completely forgotten about these people, there was nothing left of them. There were just these weird, almost house-like structures built into the earth, and some of them actually, like, if they're barrows, they go down, like the henge in this game is actually not really a henge at all. It's a barrow with henge-like structures around it, but I digress. These barrows that go down into the ground that are carved into hills and mountains and cliff sides, and to look at these and see that they just go in and in and in, and to compare them to naturally occurring caves, just it encourages this really sinister air. And you have to remember that before the advent of, you know, Christianity and the likes of even the early, what few Roman settlers ever came to Ireland, Ireland was covered in incredibly dense forests and was filled with bears and wolves and one very strange and unique breed of crow that was completely white but wasn't an albino crow. And that's all very mysterious. But it was filled with all these strange and terrible things, and you had these forests that were so dense, and these filled with these tombs and overgrown barrows, and it was all very sinister and mysterious. And you had things like bogs and that could just swallow you whole, and all sorts of sinister things. So it really was a very scary thing to the people of the time. But I'll talk more about that on another date. Speaking of the people of the time, though, you're after killing an Ogma, which brings me nicely to talking about good old Ogma. Ogma is actually a god, much like Andrast. He is one of the Tuatha Dé Danann, who were the precursors to human beings. The Irish people in pre-Christian Ireland believed that they were at least the third, maybe the fourth inhabitant of the island. Before them, and sort of almost simultaneously with the early instances of them, were the Tuatha Dé Danann, who are like your modern gods. If you think of them like the Hellenistic Greek gods, sort of your Zeuses, your Heras, your Athenas, who come sort of the most recent gods. They were these almost civilized, really brave warrior heroes. And their name means the people, almost like a nation or not a race, but a people, like a group or a tribe of the goddess Danu, who is basically, she was the big cheese. She was the head god, the big important one, and they were her people, and they were the big gods amongst the pre-Christian Ireland. They were these heroes, and Ogma was among their number. And he was the god who taught writing to the ancient Irish. He was the source of the ancient Irish writing system of Ogham, which is basically carving lines into the side of a rock. If you ever come to Ireland, you'll often see them on standing stones and in stone circles, which you can find around the place. Sometimes they're innocuous things, but it's not at all uncommon to stumble across a stone and find Ohm carved into the edge of it. It's all very, very unusual. But he was responsible for that, for teaching writing to people, and that's Ogma's story. So yeah. It should also be noted about the Tuatha Dé Danann. Their significant thing about their history was that, as I say, the Irish believed that they weren't the first to the island, they weren't even the second to the island. Before the Tuatha Dé Danann were the Fomorians, who were this ancient, quite not malevolent but dark and almost primordial race, like the Titans in Greek mythology. You can actually draw a fairly good parallel between them. And the Fomorians weren't even themselves the first race. They were more hardy, more one with the earth than the more ethereal Tuatha Dé Danann. They weren't heroic. They were almost a smattering of tribes and vagrant wanderers with a king over them. And the general feel of it is that, you know, there are these newer gods who are almost like representative of civilization, but there are these even older gods which are these titanic primordial gods that still had some semblance of civilization but were mostly of the raw earth. But even they weren't the first, because there are a smattering of vague, not quite fleshed out implications about there being some race that was there before the Fomorians who they took over from, and these were even more primordial. These were your, if you want to go back to the Greek mythology metaphor, these were your absolute primordials, your Thanatoses, your Eroses, your ethers, and your chaos incarnate. These were the oldest of the old and the most primordial of the most primordial. And you get the sort of feeling that the humans, by the time the humans come along, the Fomorians are long gone. By the time the Tuatha Dé Danann come along, these ancient primordials from before the Fomorians are long gone. So it's kind of a chain of vague histories where the humans only learn about the Fomorians through the Tuatha Dé Danann. The Tuatha Dé Danann only learn about the predecessors to the Fomorians through the Fomorians, and so the humans don't really know anything about their way back kings and so forth. So it's rather interesting. And if you talk about the kings of Ireland, Ireland, as you may or may not know, had 5 provinces, and each was ruled over by a king. And that king was like any king, you know, it's a succession of father to son or father to daughter if necessary, or what have you.
Divine ordination of some kind.
Yeah, of a sort. It wasn't necessarily considered divine, but there was a distinct air of it being, you know, this is what is done. You know, I give my title to my children and they to their children, and so on and so forth. But there is the High King. And the High King was a difficult position to even have in place because of the infighting. The provinces did not much like each other. And so you had these 5 kings, and tradition said that there would be a High King, and it was not an inherited position, it was an elected position, but it was from amongst the 5 kings. So they had to gather together at the hill of Tara, which was the seat of the High Kingship, and vote on who would be the High King. And they had to come to an agreement. It had to be a total majority. Not even total majority, a total agreement on who would be the High King, and that's why there was so few. But the High King was considered a direct, there is a direct line from the Fomorian High King to the Tuatha Dé Danann High King to the human High King, and there's just this distinct sort of line going all the way through. So it's really ingrained into the culture in general. So maybe more on that in the future. We shall see.
Yeah, I finally managed to beat a Barghest without getting hit.
Yes. Congratulations.
Yep. So, finally, at the end, I managed to display a little bit of competence.
Yes. Better late than never.
Yeah. And I get to spend the whole time until the next video trying to get the image of the Enigma of Amigara Fault out of my head when you were talking about all those burrows in the cliffside.
It will never leave you. I hope you enjoy the image. This plenty
I hope
more
everybody else watching this does too.
Yes.
I had fun and hope to see you next time.
I hope to be here next time.